are still in for a treat this afternoon. Oh, is it? She told me. Okay. All right, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, but the music is playing.
Why is it still playing? Okay.
Screen went off. Music is now on. No.
That's why I have Leah. Because I'm
Leah,
not supposed to
Leah,
touch
we
stuff.
need you.
I'm not supposed to touch anything. I'm just supposed to just read. So where is
I know, smooth jazz.
tell Leah to come.
Truly.
I know she did something and she just turned the music off, but then the thing went off. You know how to do this? No.
Do you know who else would do this?
Leah.
Oh, I know who she is.
Okay. So the music is off, but the picture is gone. Why is that? I don't know. Slides for conference. Okay. In the meantime, while we work out our visual difficulties, I want to welcome you to this afternoon's panel. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Donna Hill, the Executive Director for the Center for Black Literature, and I want to extend my gratitude for all of you coming out on a Friday afternoon to be with us. And so today's session, the representation of resistance in the literature of African diasporic writers. And we're thrilled to have as our moderator, Ijoma Oluwa, and our guest panelists, Regina Mahone, Renee Bracy Sherman, and Dr. Jennifer L. Morgan. So let me introduce our moderator. She is a Seattle-based writer, speaker, and internet yeller. All right? She's the author of the #1 best-selling, the New York Times best-selling book, So You Want to Talk About Race, Mediocre, and Being a Revolution. Her work on race and gender has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and NBC News, and she has been featured on The Daily Show and NPR's All Things Considered. Named on the Times 100 Next list and the Route 100, she's been awarded the Harvard Humanist of the Year Award, the American Humanist Association's Feminist Humanist Award, Gender Justice League's Media Justice Award, and the Equal Opportunity Institute, thank you, Aubrey Davis Visionary Leadership Award. So please welcome our moderator, Ijoma. Okay, so she is joined today by Regina Mahone. Raise your hand. A writer and editor whose work explores the intersections between race, class, and reproductive rights. As a senior editor at The Nation magazine, she edits articles on a range of topics, including national politics, and runs Repo Nation, a monthly newsletter about global efforts to protect reproductive freedom. She and her co-author, We Testify founder, Renee J.C. Sherman, they insisted on sitting next to each other, so I just want you all to know that, are authors of Liberating Abortion, Claiming Our History, Sharing Our Stories, and Building the Reproductive Future We Deserve, and are co-host of the podcast, The A-Files, A Secret History of Abortion from the Mediator. Regina has written for publications including Cosmopolitan, Elle, Rewire, News Group, Romper, The Nation, and Truth Out. She lives in New Jersey with her partner and her 2 children. Please welcome Regina Mahone. Renee Bracy Sherman, her partner in crime, is a reproductive justice activist, abortion storyteller, and writer. For a decade, she led We Testify, an organization she founded dedicated to the leadership and representation of people who have abortions and share their stories at the intersection of race, class, and gender identity. She is also an executive producer of Hours to Tell, an award-winning documentary elevating the voices of people who've had abortions. Her writing can be found in a variety of newspapers and several books, including Liberation Stories, Building Narrative Power for 21st Century Social Movements, Abortion Stories, American Literature Before Roe versus Wade, and Read This When Things Fall Apart, Letters to Activists in Crisis. In 2024, she and her co-author, Regina Mahone, released their debut book, Liberating Abortion, Claiming Our History, Sharing Our Stories, and Building the Reproductive Future. Please welcome Regina Mahone. And last but not least is Dr. Jennifer L. Morgan. She's the Silver Family Professor of History in NYU's Department of Social and Cultural Analysis and History. In 2024, she received the MacArthur Genius Award and was the Andrew R. Mellon Fellow at the New York Public Library's Coleman Center. She is the author of Reckoning with Slavery, Gender and Kinship, Capitalism in the Early Black Atlantic, which won the Mackey Nicholas Prize and the Frederick Douglass Prize, and Laboring Women, Gender and Reproduction in the Making of a New World, and Slavery. She also co-edited Connections, Histories of Race and Sex in America. Her research explores how gender and race intersected in the early Black Atlantic. She currently is working on The Eve of Slavery, a study of slavery and freedom in the 17th century, centered on Elizabeth Key, a Black woman who successfully sued for her freedom in Virginia in 1658. She also serves as executive producer for Key to Freedom, a narrative film written and directed by her daughter, Emma. Morgan has served as council chair for the Omnohondran Institute.
Everyone always gets, it's Omahandry, but don't worry about it.
Okay. Institute of Early American History and Culture, was vice president of the Berkshire Conference on Women Historians, and is a lifetime member of the Association of Black Women Historians. So please welcome our guests. And I will turn it over to our moderator.
I am so excited to be talking with y'all today, and especially around our theme of the representation of resistance in literature. And I love actually that y'all were chosen around this theme as well, because I do think that your works are not ones that people would often think of as representations of resistance. And so I think that's so important, because I think when we talk about our history and it's not clearly, this is a book of movement leaders in history, it can be hard for people to understand why our history is important to resistance. And so I would love to kind of start with y'all talking about that. And so, we have works talking about history around abortion in our community. We have a history of women in enslavement and their labor and kinship. And there is so much of our history where we are discussed as objects in history instead of subjects in history. And I would love for y'all to spend a little bit of time talking about where this history that centers us and gives a new perspective on how we have lived, where that fits in current resistance today. So whomever wants to take it first.
Yeah, please. It makes so much sense for me.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you for the invitation to talk about the history of slavery and women. I guess I want to start asking if any of you are aware of the vote that happened at the United Nations yesterday? Yes. Okay. So yesterday, for those of you who don't know, the United Nations voted on a declaration that was submitted by the African Union under the leadership of the president of Ghana to declare slavery and the transatlantic slave trade the gravest crime against humanity. President John Dramani Mahama, who's the president of Ghana and the leader of the African Union, invited me to participate in a conference the day before at the United Nations to kind of educate some of the representatives and the ambassadors about what was going to be voted on the next day. It was frankly one of the most moving honor of my life, that I was able to present to that international body the argument for why, and I will talk about this in a minute, why enslaved women and enslaved African women's bodies are at the heart of the crime of slavery and of what the transatlantic slave trade produces in this country. In any case, it's important for you to know that the resolution passed. 123 nations voted in the affirmative. 50 nations abstained, most of them from Europe. In the United States, Argentina and Israel voted no. And I would really highly recommend that you go online and find the explanation for the United States negative vote, because it is an obscenity. And it is actually enacted the way that our history is constantly being contested and erased. I think as soon as I read it, once I got over my rage, I was like, well, I will be teaching this next year and every year, because we need to understand what it means to not center the history of Black people, of racial slavery in the development of contemporary American life, and also in the development of modern capitalism. So we are living in the afterlife of slavery. And what that means in terms of how we talk about enslavement and how we talk about Black women's experience of enslavement requires us to tell the stories that we can, and I think that's another place where our work connects. Because the archives of slavery are not a place where you go and find all sorts of stories of women's lives. You have to work really hard to unearth, because of course the archive is part of the edifice of American white supremacy. And the archive itself is not designed for us to tell the stories of the dispossessed, of the immigrant, of the enslaved, of the poor. We have to work really hard to get to those stories. So I have two stories that I want to tell about specific women. Should I do that now?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So the first one relates directly to the history of reproductive justice. And that is that in 1656, a woman named Elizabeth Key, whose father was an English landowner in Virginia, was born. He had impregnated. We don't know what the nature of that relationship was, but I suspect it was involuntary. Had impregnated an enslaved Angolan woman whose name is never revealed in the records, and their daughter Elizabeth was born. Elizabeth was illegally enslaved. She was born free, she was put into an indenture, and she was supposed to remain free. At the age of 25, she goes to court, and she successfully argues for her freedom based on descent, based on the fact that she would have inherited her status as free from her white English father. It's a complicated space of erasure, but she wins her freedom. 4 years later, the Virginia House of Legislation meets and says, whereas there's been some confusion, from here on out, the condition of a child born to a Negro woman follows that of the mother. What that does is it produces racial slavery as heritable. It produces slavery as racialized, which is a new way of thinking about slavery. And it makes women's bodies the middle passage. It means that enslaved African women can only deliver commodity. They cannot deliver kinship, right? And if we think back on the panel we had this morning about what it means to be in and out of family and what it means to have your family ties denied, I think that what we see there is that women's reproductive capacity and women's reproductive potential is at the heart of what racial slavery did to African people and their descendants, and at the heart of what we're grappling with today. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to tell my other story later because it's a little different.
Thank you all so much for having us here and for including our book about abortion on this panel about resistance, because it's just like says everything you need to know about abortion. But it was really important for Renee and I to write this book because we knew that the stories we were hearing, both when we had our abortions, but also in the years after our abortions, were told through someone else's lens. We're told without centering the experiences of people of color, without the richness of that history, without the traditions and cultures that, and it was actually difficult for us to find that information at first. And so I think for us, we were writing this book because we wanted, and now I have a daughter, and we wanted to be able to share those stories as if we could share them with our younger selves, or as we can share them with the young people in our lives and the young people of future generations. And because you shared a story, I would like to share a story. But I've been thinking, I think so much, when I think about abortion and I think about resistance, I think so much about Rosie Jimenez, who comes up in our book. And I bring her up now because, so the way that we've come to understand Rosie and how important she is to our history has been through this white lens, and we unpack it in our book. But so much. So Rosie Jimenez was a 27-year-old woman of Texas, Mexican-American woman of Texas, who had an abortion, her third abortion. She had a 4-year-old child. She knew she could not handle any more children. She was planning on going to school, had even gotten some financial aid money to cover the cost of her education. And she went to have that third abortion and went to her doctor who had provided her previous abortions. And that doctor said, well, the law just changed because this new ban on abortion funding called the Hyde Amendment had taken effect in Texas, and she couldn't get that abortion. And so she chose a couple of routes. She ended up having an abortion, an illegal abortion in the state of Texas, because her doctor wouldn't provide her with one. And that illegal abortion killed her. And the way that we hear of Rosie's story is, as I said, through this lens that doesn't fully encapsulate what happened with her, because she was someone who had multiple abortions. We don't like to talk about that, but people who have abortions sometimes have more than one, and that's okay. She was already a mother, and she knew exactly what she needed to do to be able to build a different life for her daughter, a life that was different from her migrant farm worker parents and what they could provide for her. But through this feminist lens, we've been told that Rosie was a martyr, right? She was a martyr. We have to get rid of the Hyde Amendment, because if not for the Hyde Amendment, Rosie would have survived. And while that's partially true, the reality is people get turned away from doctors' offices all the time, and we don't focus enough on the fact that that's a system that's been broken. And when we look at that was under Roe. So Roe was the law of the land, and Rosie went to have an abortion just a few years after Roe, and she couldn't get one, and she died. And so we have to tell fuller stories, because when we start to tell those fuller stories, we start to better understand what happens to people of color in this country and what happens specifically to Black women in this country. We talk, when we were writing our book, people, and since publishing it, people often ask us, you're going to have to talk a lot about Roe in this book, I guess, because, Roe is being overturned, because we were writing our book before Roe was overturned. And we're like, well, that's kind of like part of the story, because we went back thousands of years to tell a much deeper history of abortion and the way that people were having abortions. And there wasn't this stigma around it that is misogynistic, because it puts the life, the so-called life of the person who's pregnant and what they're carrying above the life of the person who's actually breathing and living and trying to live their best life. And so for us, it was really important to start to really not just uncover, and I'm sure Renee will talk more about some of these stories that we uncovered, but not just uncovering those stories, but telling the truth about the stories we've been told, because so much of that is not based on our reality and the fullness of our experiences and the fullness of the failures of these systems that we have in our society, that if we get rid of the Hyde Amendment, people are still going to die because they can't get the health care that they need. And so what are we doing? How are we actually solving the problems that we have in front of us? And abortion is so much at the root of those problems.
Yeah, I actually want to go back to this point that you said, Ijeoma, about so much in the history that we are considered the objects rather than the subjects. And at its core, that is why we wrote this book. When we both had our abortions, we didn't know very many other Black women who were talking openly about their abortions. I was a big Lil' Kim fan, and so hearing rumors that Lil' Kim had an abortion, I was like, okay, cool. Like, that means there is someone. And I remember when Vanessa Williams, she had talked about her abortion, right? But it was always in this very shameful way. And it's this thing that happens so secretively. And I did not think that I knew anyone in my family who'd had an abortion. An abortion was this thing something white girls do. And when it's talked about with Black and brown folks, but in particular, because of anti-Blackness, when Black people have abortions, it's always this thing that is done to us. And also, we are centering white folks like Margaret Sanger, or we are centering men like how some of the men in Black Panthers felt, right? There's not as many perspectives from Black women's experiences on why do people have abortions. And so we really wanted to flip that narrative on its head and not only tell that story about why people have abortions, but in particular go back to this long history and complicate the narrative. I'm sure you all have heard when people say, well, abortion is like slavery, or it's worse than slavery, it's a Black genocide, right? That narrative gets complicated when you know that Black folks had abortions during slavery. Why? Because they did not want to be forced to birth children after a rape, or their children to be condemned to the horrors of slavery. When you look at it that way, you understand that reproductive autonomy and abortion as a piece of that is a key toward liberation. That is a form of resistance. And that resistance has never left us and our bodies. We actually know what we need to be able to survive. And that is to be able to decide if, when, and how to grow our families on our own terms, irrespective of society's oppression on us. And what is so important, what we felt like was so important, was to reframe it in that way, that abortion is something that we deserve. Reproductive freedom is something that we deserve. And why do you keep taking it from us? It is because you know that it is part of our liberation and it is part of our legacy. And so we really wanted to put, as you said, make a centering of Black women and our bodies as the subject, as the people who are the liberators, that we are the center of the story, and this is not something that happened to us. We also wanted to make sure that all of the other communities of color were included. We wanted to talk about some of the early histories of Asian folks having abortions, of Latinx folks having abortions, the Tainos in Puerto Rico, and then how that is connected to the genocide that both happened when white folks landed in Puerto Rico and killed everybody, but also the birth control trials that sterilized the Black and brown people there. I think I will just end with saying that the first panel talked about we have to confront these truths and these legacies that are in us. With that, we have to tell that story. We have to tell that truth because it will unlock so much of the hurt and the feeling that we feel around our bodies and our oppression. But also, we have to tell a truth, tell a real story about why we needed access to reproductive health care, including abortion, as part of our resistance. Because if they're hiding that history from us, they're actually hiding the history of how we as women, as gender queer folks, as trans folks, have resisted throughout history and how we have the keys to liberating Blackness and to ending fascism. That is why they're selling us this white-centered history and telling us that we didn't invent anything on our own. Because I swear, if I have to hear one more time that Margaret Sanger came up with abortion. Let me tell you, abortion, they've been doing it with herbs before she was a twinkle in her great-great-great-great-great-grandpappy's eye. That is something that has been ours, and we brought it when we were stolen from Africa to the United States, whether it was cotton root or other herbs or okra. Okra, peacock flower. All of those plants didn't get here by accident. It is because that we knew that we would need that as part of liberation for ourselves and our people. And I think understanding how reproduction is at the core of that will get us free in this moment as well.
That's beautiful. And I want to kind of follow up on what all of y'all said, and also want to make sure that y'all are getting questions ready in your heads to ask these amazing authors as well. So Jennifer, I would love to talk about the economic aspect of this. And I think it ties actually into both of your books quite clearly. But I think when we look at the current economic of today, we can often see how that is tied to Black bodies, Black, brown, Native bodies, how our current economic injustice that we see is. But in your work, you talk about the history of that, not as a coincidence, right, but as something deliberately constructed. And so as we see this economic injustice today, and we see the exploitation of bodies today, I would love it if you could talk a little bit about this kind of twin birthing of the commodification of Black bodies, especially Black women's bodies, and our capitalist system. And it not just, oh, we had slavery and it was a market, but the way in which we think of value and bodies.
Thank you so much. It's a really good question. I think it's hard for us in this moment in time to recognize the way in which some of the foundational ways that we think were rooted in the moment of the early modern transatlantic slave trade and early modern colonialism. Part of what Europeans bring when they come to the Americas is a desire to build wealth. And the first instinct is that they're just going to find gold on the ground and scoop it up and bring it back. What they realize, of course, is that they can't do anything without labor. And their bodies, in ways that even Columbus recognized, instantly unearthed devastating diseases on indigenous people. So when Columbus returns a year after his first landing, he notes that the population has on the island of Hispaniola had fallen by like 70%. He sees it. So they need another form of labor. And what they're doing, the connection is that the other thing that's new is this idea of long distance trade, that you take a commodity from one place and you bring it to another and it grows in value. Again, you can't do that without the labor to extract that. So slavery is part of human history. There's no moment in time when people don't capture each other and take their freedom, right? People do that to each other. It's bad. But what's different about what happens, what's unleashed in the 15th century, is this idea that there are people who are always enslavable, right? And that is shorthanded with the idea of race, of Blackness. So women's bodies are producing Blackness. Women's bodies are producing the idea of future enslaved people, because we have to really also recognize that death rates are really high. It's not like there are a lot of babies being born. It's more like an ideology. And if you think about investment and you think about futurity and the way that now we put a little money in the bank and hope that it will grow, that idea of growth is intimately connected with the idea of growth in the body of an enslaved woman. Those two things, in my first book, I talk about the fact that slave owners who had nothing would write in their wills that the first child that shall happen to be born of my enslaved woman Maria goes to my son, and the second child who shall happen to be born of my enslaved woman Maria shall go to my daughter, and the third and the fourth. there was only Maria. But he got to imagine his future, and as a result, he got to clarify that his children were free. His children were slave owners. His children were white. Maria's children were not. And that's one of the key things that I argue in Laboring Women and in Reckoning with Slavery. I also want to say, it's funny because I started to tell you the story of Elizabeth Key, and then I immediately switched to the story of the law. The thing that's important about Elizabeth Key is that she's pregnant when she goes to the court. She understands that if she slides from the category of a servant into the category of a slave, so will her child. And she can't let that happen. And so she goes to court and she makes this argument and she obtains her freedom and her children are free. And what I think is often lost for many historians is the perspective of what it means to be a woman whose reproductive capacity has been tethered to the marketplace, not to the family. To feel that, whether you have a child or not, whether you are separated from your children or not, there's a perspective, there's a conception in the minds of these early women who are enslaved in the Americas really early. I'm talking 16th and 17th century. They can see what's coming. They can see what race and racism are doing to them and to their families. And I think that's the link here, that those people who have the capacity to reproduce have to be paying attention to the terrain on which their children are going to be deposited, right? And so there's an ideology, a commitment to freedom, a desire to kind of figure out how to best protect your progeny that I think is at the heart of what it means to be Black and female in the Americas. And that is a through line that connects us from Elizabeth Key in 1656 to the woman who we just saw having to argue in court while in labor on a Zoom video. Did you see this?
Yes.
Trying to argue against the hospital that was going to compel her to have a cesarean section. This African-American woman is in labor.
She's also a doula.
And she's a birth activist, exactly. So she knows what she's trying to do. And the state and the court and the hospital are taking that away from her. And that's the connection. She knows. She knows. And I think that that's where the sort of long arc of reproductive justice and of like a commitment to resistance, where we find ourselves.
Mm-hmm. What's so powerful to me is the way that we as Black people, our resilience in bending and breaking our backs to try to protect ourselves, protect our children from what's to come, and the way that we find ways to navigate these systems, and it doesn't often like we're still having, because the goalposts move. We have to keep bending and all those things. And I mean, just that those threads between your book, Jennifer, and the resilience we see with this woman in the video defending her right to birth how she chooses, which is her right, is really powerful. So I think what's important about uncovering all of this history, to me, feels like a blueprint for where we have to go. And so I think so I want to talk a bit about how, because we're talking about the economics of reproductive freedom and reproductive justice and how it's been taken away. And I think about the system of the healthcare system. So before the mid to late 1800s, and I'm talking like thousands of years before the 1880s, people were navigating decisions around their bodies, bringing back their periods, not having abortions, bringing back their periods, taking medicine, pills, herbs, plants, using medicinal plants and things like that, to bring back their periods. There were advertisements in newspapers around, this new pill that you can take that will help bring back your period. And this is how people saw their maintenance of, and of all cultures, their maintenance of their bodies for many people. And it wasn't until the mid-1800s when the American Medical Association in the United States, at that time, which did not include black people, did not include women, so it was only white men, decided that they wanted to professionalize the field of medicine. And that meant that all of the midwives, the black midwives, the immigrant midwives in this country who had been bringing babies into the world, helping women to have their abortions if they need to have them, or to keep their reproductive systems healthy, outside of any sort of system that is then controlled by a government or people in power, we're just doing those things as a part of living, that this American Medical Association decided to push them out of the field of medicine, to convince the public that these people practicing this medicine were barbaric, that they were, they shouldn't be doing what they were doing. And a lot of this was, of course, around controlling who could have children and how they had children. And they knew that they could do that by building this healthcare system around this idea that you have to go to a doctor, a physician who's had this training that's been approved by the American Medical Association in order to have your children. And they did a lot of things to indigenous people, black people, in order to force them to go into that's okay, to go to those doctors, right? To convince them, and so now it's what to me feels all of these ideas around the way that ideas can shift how we think and act in colonial ways, colonizing ways against one another. This idea of the healthcare system as a system that can control how we receive healthcare and take care of our bodies. Like, that was an idea that is rooted in racism. But we all, even when I have two children, when I had both of my children, I'm like, well, I have to go to the hospital because that's just but it's not what we did. And that's, again, where I was saying about our history and how we uncover what we were actually, the actual history of our people and how we protected each other and supported each other in birth and in all of these experiences. And it wasn't through the system. And so 1800s, the AMA comes in. We're also seeing at this time the church, the Catholic Church, changing their minds about abortion and condemning it. And so then we start to see more and more restrictions grow all across the country. And I bring this up to go to Roe because I think we don't think about Roe in an economic way. But the reality is what Roe did in this country was it actually, it's just the opposite of liberal if you think about it. It actually made it so that people actually had to go to a doctor to continue that thread if you wanted an abortion. Because through Roe, it was a decision between you and your doctor. And so they basically made it even harder for people who were practicing medicine in the way that their people had, that their ancestors had, make it even harder for people, and then also made it a crime to practice medicine out of these systems of Roe. And then also there are lots of other things about the way that the people who oppose abortion have chipped away at that Roe and made it even more harmful and increased criminalization among people of color, among black people. But there is an economic component to the way that abortion is facilitated in this country and then has been made a crime in this country.
I want to bridge all of these things. Your questions about the economics and all of that, right? And when we see the first restrictions, abortion bans, some of the first ones are in the 1820s, and they're poison control, right? But as Regina was pointing out, they're happening in the 1860s to early 1900s. Okay, why does that matter? Well, that's the end of slavery. That's the end of black folks' reproduction becoming a profit. It is no longer something that can be capitalized on. So all of a sudden, you have black folks, black women in particular, who are being sold at the highest numbers, you can fetch a high amount if you can produce a number of children, right? A number of enslaved workers for a plantation. Now those women and her children are free. So now, all of a sudden, instead of celebrating, 'cause that's not really what they were doing, but being happy of the fecundity of a black woman, it is now a problem. Because if you think in a white supremacist perspective, you're obsessed with colonizing and numbers and how strong a nation is based on the numbers of how many people exist. And so if you are afraid that black people are going to outnumber white people, you are absolutely concerned about black people's reproduction. You might be thinking, okay, but cool, why did they criminalize abortion? Because it actually wasn't about us. They knew that they could get us back through destroying Reconstruction and indentured servitude and all of those things, right? Criminalizing abortion was actually about white women. It was about question, because here's the thing. In the Civil War, a couple of them went to go be nurses. And then they started talking about, wait a second, this Reconstruction, you're giving the right to vote and serve in office to black men? Well, gee golly, I would like that too. And so they start stepping out of place. And so now we're concerned that they're taking Madame Rastell's abortion pills that they're getting in the newspaper, and they're like, whoa, 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 what are you doing? Because you also were supposed to be having 12 kids. And what are you doing trying to only have 5 or 2 or none? What are you doing? And so with that, they start criminalizing abortion and all the abortion providers. As Regina said, those tend to be black and brown people. Where does the capitalism come in? At that point, then you do still need an underclass of people who will make sure capitalism functions, that they are earning low wages, that they are not able to move up in class, right? So with that, you then have to still control the fertility of black and brown people. So of course we know that you don't get educated, you can't work certain jobs, but also part of that to make sure that black folks then don't have other children and are never able to control their fertility, we will control it for you. So we deny access to contraception. And we have forced sterilization and coercion. And you see the eugenics movement bud at that point, because they want to have a whole class of like, who are the smart people and who should be inheriting the earth. And so you do see a mix of the reproductive movement at that time and the eugenics movement in service of white supremacy. And still we rise because we were still providing abortions at that time. And one of the stories that we tell in this book is of a midwife in Washington, D.C. And she gets arrested for providing an abortion to this black woman to a white woman. She is a black woman. And we're like wondering, okay, she got arrested. She's like being alleged of killing this white woman. Oh my God, what happened to her, right? I find this story because I'm like going through newspapers.com because the historians haven't written about it. So I happen to go through newspapers.com. I find her in there. And I'm like looking and looking. She gets arrested. How many of you think that she was convicted for killing this white woman? You're wrong. She was not. Because at that time, they still did not actually think of abortion as a crime. They looked at it as black folks are over there doing their own thing. Because she has with a jury of her peers, right? Black folks are doing their own thing. What they are deeply concerned about is white women. And that white woman was doing something she wasn't supposed to be doing. Now, we do see a shift with the media and a demonization of abortion providers, as Regina talked about. And again, at that same time, that's in the 1920s and 1930s, right? You have the collapse of an entire economy. You need a whole class of low-wage workers. You also have immigrants coming to this country who are not considered white. And so you, again, need a class of low-wage workers for white people to be on top. This actually continues as a cycle. And that is why they are so concerned. Anytime you have the criminalization of abortion, look back any time in history, it is at the exact same time that they are concerned about black folks getting free, increased immigration, and white women not wanting to have all them kids. It's happening right now. And so they criminalize abortion, but they also engage eugenics. And I want to be clear that they are also doing it right now. There are two types of eugenics. There's positive eugenics and negative eugenics. I did not come up with those terms. Negative eugenics is the one that we're used to, where it's sterilizing people, not allowing genocide, not allowing people to have children. But there's also positive eugenics, and is this idea of lightening a population through only immigration of white people or people that we deem as contributors to society. That is happening right now, and it is always tied to capitalism. It is always tied to who is deserving of the resources in this nation, and also who needs to be a permanent underclass. And so when you can control people's reproduction, when you can control their access to education and information, you can control the movement that people have through the classes. And so what I think is really important when we understand history of abortion, think about, who does the narrative serve? Does it actually serve us? Or does it serve an oppression of us and actually not allowing us to have full control over our reproduction in service of capitalism? And making sure that white folks have what they need and we stay a permanent underclass in service of or filling jails, low wages, all of those things. You have to look at it from a capitalist perspective and understand that the racism and the capitalism and the reproduction have always been tied together from slavery until now.
Thank you all for that. It's amazing, and it has my brain firing on a lot of different cylinders right now, because I've actually been thinking a lot about misogynoir. And I think this also ties directly in the battle for black women's bodies. And when I say the battle for black women's bodies, I'm talking about the ethos, because of course this impacts multiple bodies, not just black women's bodies. It impacts black trans people, queer people, intersex people, disabled people as well. There's a lot of ableism in viewing black women's bodies as commodities. And when we look at it in that lens and the battle for control over black women's reproduction, misogynoir fits in this patriarchal idea that liberation for black men means winning that control or wresting it from white men. And I think it's so important that we look at that as part of this root here as well, because as we can talk about our language around abortion, we can talk about our history, but if we also don't talk about how we're defining liberation and how it's also been shaped by this idea that black women's bodies are commodities, and there are people who are actively fighting for their version of liberation that has us as commodities to other people that aren't white men. I think that's so important when we're talking about liberation. We're gonna hand it over to questions really soon, but I would love just briefly, if y'all could mention, because we talk about history, and history is so important, right? And I think as writers who write a lot about history, we can see through lines. But it can be hard for people to know what to do with history. There is use in countering the gaslighting of society to know our history, but there's a practicality as well when it comes to looking at the world we're in today. So I would love it if you could each just briefly talk about the practicality of knowing this and how it can inform our fight for liberation right now.
I can go real quick. I mean, I think building on what I was just saying about like the tie-in of capitalism, I think we need to really understand how capitalism, anti-Blackness, has us thinking about Black women's reproduction, and the way that we think about folks in our own community, and how much we might have bought into assumptions about Black women who are poor and parenting, who have a lot of kids and parenting, and that we have to stand up for that, and we cannot continue to allow that misogynoir to show up. Because again, it used to be a Black woman having a lot of kids was profitable, and now it's a problem. And I think it's really important that every time some sort of social safety net is gutted, they use Black women's use of it as a reason for gutting it, as an entitlement. I don't have to explain to you all like the history of the welfare queen as a trope, right? But what I think is interesting is the way that that identity is so deeply denigrated. He used it in such a nasty way instead of thinking about a Black woman who is making sure that there are resources in her community from the tax dollars she paid. Can we flip that on its head? I also encourage people to think about how reproductive stigma or abortion stigma shows up in your own lives, in your own interactions. We actually can make a difference in our communities right now. When somebody comes up to you and tells you that they're pregnant, what is the first thing that might pop into your head, and is it kind? Because I got friends every once in a while and they're like, I'm pregnant. And you're like, with him? Really? You keeping it? Yeah. Okay. Your body, your choice, girl. That happens. We're all human. And what does it look like for us to shift our frame, and how can I support you? What supports do you need? How can I make sure that there is information available to you and resources back into our community for you? And I think we have to really push back on these narratives that are extremely based in misogynoir, based in capitalism, of that poor folks, low-income folks don't make good parents. They're deeply anti-Black. We have an entire system that takes children away from Black parents simply because they don't have food in the fridge or somewhere to live. Right. If the family policing system, when they show up and they see that there's no food in the fridge, what if they actually just came with a bag of groceries? What if you came and helped? But instead, we are legally and physically separating the ties of parents from their children and incarcerating parents and thinking that that's somehow going to help. So I think my ask for all of you is, whether it's around abortion or not, just in reproduction in general, ask yourself how you are showing up for the pregnant and parenting people in your lives, and how are we making sure in our communities that everyone has the ability to decide if, when, and how to grow their families on their own terms, whether that's being able to get that C-section, being able to afford formula, having a home over their heads, or also just not talking badly about people when they're going through a tough time during their pregnancy and parenting. Be a bit more generous. And I know, it happens. We're all humans. And I think that is actually how we change the culture. We don't need to be people who continue to carry that misogynoir around reproduction that we have seen for hundreds of years. We don't need to continue that in our own community. And we actually can show this is how we show up for Black and brown people who are parenting.
Sure. I'll hold this. It's awkward. So it took Renee and I 5 years to write our book. And while we were writing our book, we started out in the late 2010s. we were worried that somebody else was going to write our book before we wrote it. And the whole time, we were just like, how is it that no one else has written a book about abortion centering people of color, centering Black people? Like, somebody's going to do it before we do it. And it didn't happen. And it actually, the day that our book came out, another book about abortion came out by someone who is not a Black person or a person of color.
A white woman.
A white woman. It's like, how do I not give this away?
She's the more generous of us.
Yes. And that book I think, has gotten a lot more attention than our book. And the reality is, like, our book, our subtitle is Claiming Our History. Because in our book, we're claiming our history, and it is a history that is, yes, hard at times, but also joyful. It's yellow for a reason, because this is our resistance, and this is our resilience as Black people, and our legacy. And people don't always want those stories. Like, people want the painful story. People want the trauma of, it's the pathology of Black people, of Black women, of Black mothers. We have to be dying in order for people to want to hear about it. When actually we're trying to tell a different story. We're trying to refocus, and not even trying, we did. We are refocusing the narrative around our full experiences. And so I would just say, like, our history is so important, and I'm so deeply grateful that we're able to share this history here, because like I said, it didn't get as much of attention as this other book, because it's a different story. It's not rooted in, yes, there's some trauma, but there is also other things and other beautiful things about our experience, and the way that the community shows up for, you were talking, EGMO, when you posted about the book, the way that our community shows up for Black people, for Black abortion providers, for Black people who need abortions. And that isn't a story that people always want to hear, so just keep telling those stories. We really appreciate it.
I guess I would end by saying, both of you all have used have talked about storytelling and have talked about the importance of narrative, and our panel this morning did the same thing. The work of the historian is the work of rediscovering a different set of stories, and using your own experience to help you interpret those stories. So I'm going to end with a story of a woman who did something that, 1683, because I refuse to talk about anything after 1720. 1683, there's a slave ship called the Dorothy that's anchored off the coast of Ghana, and the ship captain had been loading captives for some weeks, and the people who were on board were seeing what was happening. Also, you might find this confusing. I did too the first time I read it. At this time, ship captains let enslaved captives smoke tobacco. The sailors did it, the captains did it, and it was available. There's a woman who's standing with a pipe, smoking in the evening, and because she's a woman, she's on the deck, she's not in the hold, because women were allowed, because it gave the crew sexual access to them. And a sailor from across the boat watched her take a drag on this pipe and then drop it into the hold where the gunpowder was stored, and blew that ship to kingdom come. Some people, very few, survived, and they were testifying in court back in England some months later about the carelessness of this woman. And in the record, that's the only thing. I don't know her name. I don't know when she was captured. I don't know anything. I just see her described as a careless Negro woman. And I said, maybe that was an act of care. Maybe she saw what was about to happen to her and to the 180 people who were on board that ship in the hold. And maybe she made a decision about where that gunpowder was and what she was going to do. So I think it's not a story of liberation exactly, but it's a story that demands that we inhabit the evidence from from a new perspective to tell the story of how important our lives have been to the history of this country, to the history of resistance, to the history of opposition. And so I guess I would say that what we need to do is retell our stories.
That's beautiful. And I'll say, I find a through line in your work in finding love in how we survive in very unexpected ways, right? People do not think of abortion often as a loving act, and especially a community loving act. But I was struck, as I said when I posted about your book, I was crying at the immense love of providers. And even as you're telling the story of this woman, the immense love in deciding to take such an action to prevent what she saw coming, right? And I think it's so important that we recognize that even in the ways we define love are often defined by white supremacy. And when we look at struggle and the way that we're defined, the ways in which we've cared for each other and shown these extreme acts of love are often erased in our stories. And I'd say right now, more than ever, as we're facing rough times, it is so vital that we look at our survival as acts of love over and over and over and over. We're gonna open up to questions. And so I would love it if y'all have questions to ask. And because we have been running behind and we wanna get people time to answer questions, I will remind people that questions have a beginning, middle, and end, and that end has a question mark. So,
Thank you for the sentence structure.
First of all,
Yeah, it's on.
First of all, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I feel like my thought process, my appreciation, my awareness has been expanded just by sitting here and listening. So first of all, just gratitude, lots of gratitude. The question is one part. There are two books that I just finished reading. One is The Conjuring of America.
So good.
And the other one is Wayward Women by Sadia Hartman.
Yes.
And the idea of black women as magic makers, as mermaids, as storytellers, and how we show up and claim our history and claim our right to make our history in literature and storytelling. My question is, how do we take the narrative of our waywardness and own it as a birthright?
She asked how do we take our waywardness, and she's quoting Sadia Hartman's most recent book on wayward girls, and claim it as a birthright. It's such a great question.
I mean, I'll just say I'm always here for black women's rights and wrongs, right? And I think that we have to reframe what is the wrong, right? Like good for her for throwing that.
Dropping that pipe. That's exactly how I.
Good. I'm glad. And I'm sitting here imagining, I wonder if she had a whole conversation with everyone else and was like, yo, because they're so misogynistic, they let me up there. I bet I could do it. Yeah. Y'all ready?
I know where the gunpowder is.
Right? And I also think, because like something such as there's a flower, peacock flower, that was used in Suriname for folks to enslave black folks and enslaved indigenous folks to provide abortions. And in the documentation of it from 1705 in this book, Metamorphosis, the woman writes, that they used the seeds of the plant to cause abortions. And then she said that sometimes, because the Dutch enslavers treated them so poorly, that they would sneak off into the forest and kill themselves or also kill their children. And she says, I know this because they told me this themselves. And you might sit here and think, maybe not us, but people will be like, wow, infanticide, that's universally terrible. And I think the question is let's complicate it a bit. Is it? That, what does it mean for someone to have birthed an entire human and then have said, I actually don't want you to live in this pain, and to have to do that on her own with her bare hands because she knows that that's something better than the horrors on this planet. That is an act of love. And so I think taking a reframe is how we challenge and reframe our waywardness. I think it's so important that we actually put a different perspective and remember that with whatever narrative we're given, who does that serve? And that's where I think empathy comes in, of like, what must it mean for that mama to have to do that? And why? And how bad was what was happening? And also, what she talked to, what was written in this documentation was also that the folks felt like if when they killed themselves or the infanticide, when they died, they would be reincarnated, reborn back on the continent. So that is, they were imagining, that's Afrofuturism right there. That is absolutely Afrofuturism. That is envisioning liberation. That is envisioning something different. And so you can sit here and say that they're bad people for what they did, or we can challenge that narrative and wonder, what must it have been like for them to do that? And what were they envisioning, what was next that came from that act? Sorry, go ahead.
No. Let's have more questions. Yeah. You did. That was a good answer.
As someone comes up, I want to add to how many of y'all have read Frantz Fanon? So Frantz Fanon talks about Manichaeism and the need for the death of that, which is the idea of the endless battle between good and evil. Mm-hmm. And he talks about that as part of the root of colonial constructs and exploitations, that if you can define one party as good and one party as evil, then you can justify acts against them. And so I'll also say complicating our stories is vital to destruct that dichotomy, so that we do not get to be framed as only good or only evil, but as whole human beings, so that we don't allow ourselves to be painted in any particular way, that we insist on saying, yes, I am complicated. Yes, I do good and bad, and that makes me human instead of someone who can fit into this dichotomy. I think that's also a really important anti-colonial construct.
I love when it just turns into a whole conversation. Go for it.
I just want to add, so I'm a psychotherapist, and
Yes.
what I work with my clients on doing is deconstructing this ideology around good and bad. What if it is just what's in alignment with you and what is not in alignment with you, right? Because what works today may not work tomorrow, right? And so, shifting that perspective from it being a tangible either or, to and both.
Yeah.
And I'll just say ditto in Yoruba and Benin cosmology. There is no such thing as that kind of good evil. But I have a very practical question, and then I have a request. The practical question is, could you geniuses please give us a list of fictional narratives that we can share with youth that tell the stories that you're telling right here, historical as well, so that it's not just us beating them over the head with facts and opinions, but they actually get to read it. Besides Beloved, okay? And then the second question. Thank you, damn. That's too easy.
I
And
know.
the second-
You're right. You're totally
the
right.
second question is, for those of you in the academy, do you allow people to audit your classes? I mean, I'm a African Studies major from way back, and I'd like to refresh. I need this. I need to be hearing this at least for a semester, okay?
Yeah.
So if you do allow people to audit, or if you have your own private classes, on the internet or whatever, let us know, please. I need more of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Esmeralda Simmons, formerly of Medgar College, Center for Law and Social Justice. I'm a racial justice attorney.
Did you want to?
Yes, I want to start. Of course, she said besides Beloved, but of course you have to start with Beloved. But I would say that I've recently read 2 novels about enslaved women that I think are crucial. And the first is Caitlin Greenidge's Liberty, but Liberty with an I-E on the end, not with a Y. And then the other, just give me 2 seconds, because I want to give you the right, I'm going to give you the right title in just a minute. But I want to say to answer the question about auditing classes, one of the things that we have to be attentive to right now is that the universities are shutting people out. So I would say anybody in this room I teach a big lecture course called the Black Atlantic, and I would say anybody in this room is welcome to sit in on that class. However, NYU won't let you in the building.
Yeah.
You can't walk into a campus anymore without a whole lot of mishigas. And I think that that's something that we have to be really attentive to. And some of my colleagues and I are talking about ways to create a more public way of teaching, a more public way of, that's why I'm working on a film, for example. That's why I want to be in conversations that are outside of academic spaces, although I think this is an academic space that seems very open, and that feels really good.
Some professors at Howard that started it online.
Absolutely. Exactly, and I think that there's, yeah, absolutely. So I would say that we have to also push ourselves. Those of us who are in academia have to push ourselves to figure out ways to open those doors, because the university is not helping. You answer the question. I'm going to find the
Yes.
title.
Okay. Well, I can't invite you to my class because I'm a PhD student at American University in School of Communications, baby. But if ever have a class, you're welcome to come. But right now, I'm sitting in class and auditing a bunch of classes. Okay. Books. We're going to talk about 2. One, I just want to plug our little podcast that we had. We had a series of a podcast. It was 8 episodes, talking basically it was before the book came out, about a lot of these histories and the narratives that we know about abortion. And our ending segment was called There Are Other Books, because we got so sick and tired of any time someone would ask about a book about repro or abortion, they'd be like, The Handmaid's Tale. And we were like, cool. What else? So we have an entire list of books. We wrote an article in Elle magazine on it, but
17 books.
Yes, 17 books. But there's even more than that. So, and I can't name them all. But if you search my name and bookshop.org, go find my shop on bookshop.org. I have an entire list for you of books that have abortions in them. There's a black romance book called Zenny that has an abortion in it. But the one I want to recommend today, the author will be here tomorrow, Dolan Perkins Valdez. She has 2 books that are excellent. One of them is Wench, and it takes place during slavery, and it has, tiny spoiler, infanticide as well as abortion. It's excellent. Also, Take My Hand. It's a historical fiction on the forced sterilization of the Ralph sisters and the nurse who uncovers that they were forcibly sterilized by the United States government. And it parallels her abortion story, and also in 2016, the impending fall of Roe. And so that's an incredible book that young people can read. Dolan will be here tomorrow. You should totally ask her about it. But her books are great. And there's another new one. Oh, okay, I'm going to do one more. Another one that's incredible is by Layla Motley. It's called The Girls Who Grew Big. And it is about young people and parenting and their experience in Florida. There's a self-managed abortion in it. Layla Motley she wrote her first book, Night Crawling, at 17, and I think she's 24 now. She's an incredible writer, and so The Girls Who Grew Big came out last June, and it is one of the best books I've ever read. So absolutely, that one.
So I'm going to suggest These Heathens, and I'm blanking on...
Mia Mackenzie.
Mia Mackenzie
also
is
came
the
out
author.
last June.
Yes, but it's such a beautiful book. It's about a young black girl who discovers she's pregnant, needs an abortion, and goes on this incredible journey throughout the book to get her abortion. It's in the 60s. It's in the South. It's her encountering civil rights activists, including Martin Luther King Jr. is in the book.
Coretta's in there.
Coretta's in the book.
Bayard.
I'm not giving away any spoilers, but it is a book that is very empowering and funny about abortion.
These Heathens by
These
Mia
Heathens.
McKenzie.
It is so funny. Highly recommend it.
Go to our little bookshop shop. I promise you, they're all up there, and I update it all the time. The A Files: A Secret History of Abortion. I forgot to say that.
I'm not asking a question. I just wanted to add another book.
Yes,
please.
please.
We read in our book club, the Center for Black Literature Book Club has a list of books, but we just finished the infamous Rosalie. Oh, I read that one. The Haitian writer. Okay. She has a scene.
The infamous Rosalie.
Infamous Rosalie by Aveline Trujillo. I don't know.
Eveline Trujillo.
Truly.
Yes. And there's a scene in the book, and I won't give it away if I say this right.
I mean, if you're saying it's an abortion book, spoiler, but it's great.
No, but the midwife, had kept a coil around.
Yeah.
No more. Okay, but read it.
I love it.
It's really a fascinating, very strong book.
Okay, I'll add that to the list.
And for the question around classes as well, Dr. Michelle Taylor, also known as Feminista Jones online, has an Afrocentric school online that she puts together every year. She's currently taking submissions for classes that people want to teach this year. So that's also a thing to look for if you want to continue kind of a more Afrocentric, especially led by Black women, education, and that's geared towards adults. Her name is Dr. Michelle Taylor. Online and social media, she's known as Feminista Jones.
And also, I think Karen Attia is also doing something very similar. She used to be at the Washington Post and is doing incredible work.
Thank you so much for this presentation. Full disclosure, this is a question regarding pro-life, quote unquote, and pro-choice. I was raised in a Christian family. I'm a Black man, and I'm just curious, how resistance can be also considered in the context of the rhetoric game. How do we win that? How do you, for instance, if it makes sense, how can you be pro-life if you're pro-capital punishment once the same babies turn 18? How can you be pro-life if they're against gun control and kids are getting blown up, and riddled with bullets in classrooms every year? How is that not a kind of hypocrisy, and how do we make sure that people are understanding the same way that we see Beloved with Margaret Gardner, and how that's a form of resistance, or the enslaved women who jumped overboard on slave ships? That's called resistance. It's not called just simply suicide, the Igbo landing, all these different examples, oftentimes by enslaved Black women or just Black women in general. How do we get even people who have the same skin color as us, sometimes in our own family members? How do we push back against either misogyny, misogynoir, with a focus on saying this isn't pro-life, this is pro-death, maybe anti-choice, maybe how do we make sure that we win in that form of resistance as well?
Can I jump in? So one of the things that I think is the most powerful example of the power of language is the work to reframe abortion rights as reproductive justice, and which was an act done by a group of African American women who came together in a conference in, I think, 1994 to say, we need to stop talking about this just as an abortion rights issue, but as that everybody needs to have the right to have autonomy over their body, to have a child, to grow their family when they want to, or to choose not to. And I think that the way that I'm pretty sure we've all heard the term reproductive justice is a really good example of what it means to change the language. So for example, I just never used the term pro-life. It's not a useful, I'm pro-life. We are pro-life. We're identifying the ways in which people need support to have life, right? And I think that in our families, in our intimate spaces, it's very powerful to have people say, well, yes, this is my abortion story, because tell our abortion stories, and so therefore there is no such thing as an abortion story, right? But even if that's not your story, to say like the stories that we tell and around our kitchen tables or our family gatherings, or those are important places to do really, really crucial political work. And I think you've identified that. Like, how do you talk in your family? And I think that that's the hard work of, again, to like pull it, of storytelling, of narrative, of the words we use, and of how we can look to the past to find examples of how people are changing the narrative, right?
There's a beautiful document, just because I do think there are documentaries, media that you can watch around people and encourage them to watch it, to have more nuanced conversations around these issues. And there's a beautiful one that came out recently called The Devil is Busy, and it's centered around this Atlanta clinic run by our friend Kwajalein, called the Feminist Women's Health Center, and they're providing abortions, and it provides perspectives from, it's sort of like following the woman who works as for security at the clinic, but like following her day basically from beginning to end, but you get different points of view from the patients, from the providers, from the folks who are advocating outside against abortion. And there's this snapshot of, and I keep thinking about it, the snapshot of this like Black Lives Matter sign outside of it. And there, because of course, as Renee was talking about earlier, the argument that, abortion is Black genocide, and so we need to save all Black lives, including these quote unquote unborn Black lives. But for me, I so often just go back to like, what gives someone else the right to tell me or to tell anybody else what to do with their body? Because that's what slavery was, right? And so, and we tell the complete story of reproductive justice in our book, and really going back to not just that moment in Chicago, which was also a very important moment for the movement for reproductive justice, but before that, there were all of these important steps, including this pamphlet that Renee recently got. I'm so jealous. It looks gorgeous. An original copy of the pamphlet, We Remember, where Black women are explaining exactly how these through lines between having, being forced to reproduce to today, having no choice because of the systems that are in place that make it inaccessible, or make it not even just inaccessible to have abortions, but inaccessible to raise our children, inaccessible to find housing, to find food, to get jobs that pay us an income that actually allows us to do all of those things. And so I think what Jennifer was saying, like when you start to open it up to reproductive justice and really grounding the people who are directly affected by these things in that conversation, it's a different conversation. And I think you should encourage, and all of us can encourage people to think about why it is that they are so uncomfortable with Black women making decisions about our own bodies. Because that, to me, is the root of all of it. Like, why are you so uncomfortable by that? Because that sounds like a you problem more than a us problem. We're just trying to get access to the things that we know that we need. And why are you getting in the way of that? Not you personally, but
can I say one of the things that I just finished rereading Dorothy Roberts' Shattered Bonds, which is a history of family policing and of the long history of separating Black families in the name of protecting children. And it's a manifesto for abolition. It's an abolitionist. She says the child welfare system needs to be abolished. And when I started reading that, I thought to myself, it felt like a huge step, right? And when I ended reading that, I was like, I am 100% an abolitionist, because she so clearly talks about the way that the system of how we treat Black children is rooted in a desire to control, and is rooted in white supremacy, and is rooted in the criminalization of Black populations. It is unthinkable what we have authorized in the name of a pretense of protecting children. And so I think that that's another really good example of what it means. Like, why is this country so committed to refusing to give Black women the support that is needed in order to raise a family? And the answer to that question is really complicated, but I think we need to be having more conversations about what's at the heart of this kind of systemic violence. And as a historian of slavery, I see where it begins is in the history of slavery. But that does not by any means mean that we're at the end of it.
I would just say, one, stop calling them pro-life. Like, I don't understand why we're gonna participate in our own dehumanization and allow them to continue to spread this lie that we know is not true. Just like we're not gonna sit there and be like, the KKK is a Christian organization. Like, we don't do that. We don't just say, oh, those white Christians in bed sheets. We don't say that. So why do we allow them to continue to, and I'm talking about pro-life organizations. Now, can I have a question about people who identify as pro-life, and I'll get there in just a second. But I mean, I shout out to my professor. I'm taking a class over at Howard, Dr. Lauren Coleman. We're doing a class. And shout out to you, Dr. Brock, because we've been reading your work too. But the way in which we have to denaturalize, she's always use the language, denaturalize the language, denaturalize these messages that are being fed to us. They have naturalized it in such a way that pro-life means the complete opposite of what it means. They're out here cheering on genocides and taking over a whole bunch of other countries and separating families. That's not family values. So stop. So I think that we have to stop helping them in that. When it comes to people who identify as pro-life, say in our families, your body, your choice, whatever. But what I do is I ask some questions. What do you want it to look like when somebody is pregnant? What kind of supports do you want out there? How do you want the society to show up for them? What kind of resources do you think our communities should be providing, right? Ask them those questions, and then ask them if the leaders they support are actually doing any of that, because they're not. And that's why I think it's so important for us. We center this book in reproductive justice, as we have an entire chapter about the founding of it, the history, because it's not only complicating the narrative, but it also calls to task the pro-choice movement, in which they were making sure people had the right to an abortion, but not actual access to it, or not actual access to be able to be parents. They were allowing President Clinton to gut welfare and still calling him pro-choice, because he's also not. And neither was Biden. You can't say the word abortion. You're not showing up for black and brown people. You're not showing up for poor folks and their ability to parent. You are not pro-choice. That's actually just eugenics, guys. And I know folks don't want to hear it, but it really is. If you actively have policies that do not make sure poor folks, black and brown folks, can have children, that's eugenics. And that's a problem. What I wanted to your point about, becoming an abolitionist, I was reading Dorothy Roberts' work. If you have not read Dorothy Roberts' work, you must. Literally pick up anything she's written, go watch a video. She is, I think, one of the most brilliant people I feel like I have the honor of knowing. And she's about to retire, so she just did her next book, her last book, or maybe not her last, but it's not her last, but she's at least gonna not be teaching anymore. But I think soak up all you can from her, because she is just so brilliant as a scholar in thinking about what does it mean for black bodies in this country to be able to reproduce free of coercion and criminalization. And I think,
The title of the first book.
Killing the Black Body is her first book that is absolutely incredible. She has another one, there's Shattered Bonds that you mentioned. Torn Apart is a more recent one. And her newest one that she's on tour for right now is called The Mixed Marriage Project. And anyway, go find her on tour. She's amazing. But what I will also say is the one thing that shifted for me in writing this book, in going through this 6,500-year history of abortion, is that the only way that we will liberate our reproduction is through abolition. Because at every single stop, the people that they have used to curtail our reproduction have been the police. And I think that's when people ask me, like, what's the one thing you learned about, like, during writing your book? And it was like, I was always like, ACAB, you know, fuck the police, whatever. But, like, actually nothing you want to do is actually going to be possible so long as policing exists. There is no reproductive freedom with cops on this planet. And that's here, that's everywhere. And I think it's really important that we understand that we live in an extremely policed society, but also as this nation, we are the world cops. You can see what we're doing in Congo, Palestine, Venezuela, Cuba. I don't know, did we do anybody today? Like Iran? Yes, thank you. I'm like, I don't know, there's just so many. Like, it's been the last month. We're recolonizing the world. And we're doing it through policing. And I think it's really important. We also, in all of those countries, also ask yourself, what does it mean to be pregnant in all of those situations? Right now, there are folks dying in Cuba because they cannot give birth. In Palestine, same thing. The miscarriage rate went up. People were dying in childbirth. All because of capitalism and our obsession with policing and colonialism. So, like, I'm sorry, anybody who sits there and is like, I'm pro-life. And I'm like, where, babe? Where? Because if they were like hated abortion, but then like, I don't know, we're great everywhere else, maybe we could have a conversation, but I have yet to find that person.
That's beautiful. I think we have one more question, and I'll also add to this too. When we're talking about books and things like this, it's important to understand who buys books about women's stories, Black women's stories, and who doesn't. And I actually don't believe that you can come out of understanding the totality of Black women's lives and birthing people's lives, and I don't think you can understand the totality of that and come out of that, quote unquote, pro-life.
Right.
And so challenging people who say this to actually engage with the totality of the lives of people who are most impacted by this sort of legislation and control over birthing bodies, I think is also where to start. And that also means if you've had an abortion and you have sons, your sons need to know. You know, if your partners need to know, your brothers need to know. The weight of what it means to have a birthing body in this country needs to be shared by more than just the birthing bodies, because that weight isn't created by us. And so, you know, my fellow author Sonora Jaw recounts in one of her books telling her son about surviving rape. And she said it was uncomfortable, but he needed to know. He needed to know not only that she went through that, but that she survived it, and that this is what it looks like to move through it. And I realized when my son was talking about sexual assault in his school, and he said to me, oh, I think her life is over, that I hadn't had that conversation with him about my sexual assault. And I realized why it was so important, because he is inheriting a huge amount of power in the world. And if starting with the most important woman in his life, if he can't understand the totality of the decisions he's going to be asked to make, because I didn't share, I have also failed as a mother to communicate that. So I would say challenging people, especially those who don't live in these bodies, to learn more about the totality before they think they can say anything about us is really, really important. Last question.
I want to thank you all for being on this panel today. I've learned a lot, and I'm just very grateful to be here in this space. Can you hear me? I don't know if the mic is working. Can you hear me?
It's working, okay. But you have to really
get in there.
Okay, there we go. Woo! All right. So someone on the panel, when they were doing the bio, said that they were like a yeller on the internet. Yes. I am as well, and while I was yelling on the internet, I was also learning, and I came across this term called epigenetics. The idea that like our environmental traumas can shape how our genes are expressed, and can be carried across generations, meaning that whatever happened to our great-grandma, great-granny, and them can actually pass on to us. And so I wonder if the resistance in African diasporic literature is less of a choice and more of an inheritance, and how do you see that tension between the agency and inheritance shaping these stories that we tell?
Wait, I just want to plug an event because Kiara Bridges, who just wrote a book called Expecting Inequity, who is an epigenetic expert, is coming to Brooklyn. She might even be on her way here on April 2nd. And so we can talk afterward if you're interested, or you can just look it up. But Kiara, Khiara Bridges, she's a UC Berkeley law professor and a PhD in anthropology. Incredibly brilliant person who can speak a lot more than I could ever speak about epigenetics. So I just wanted to share that in case it's helpful.
I mean, I think that's such a good question. I think it's hard for me to parse that, because part of the water that I swim in is in kind of thinking about the afterlife of slavery, like the way that slavery kind of echoes down, like through the generations into contemporary life. And so that would mean that the way that enslaved women historically resisted slavery and the way that contemporary women resist racism and exploitation and capitalist oppression are obviously linked because the structure is linked. And that's a different argument than the way that which is it that the structure is linked, or is it that our response is somehow linked and hailed? And I think that listening to Black feminist scholars who are trying to understand epigenetics is the way to start. So I would just second the recommendation of Kiara Bridges, because she is utterly brilliant. I've heard her present on this work that she's now published, and I think it will be very helpful for us to think about what does it mean to both kind of recognize the genetic realities that we live in, but also to recognize the ways. I mean, history is not. It's not just a circle, right? It reverberates. Christina Sharp says that we live in the wake of slavery, and like the wake meaning when a ship goes through the water, the waves don't just reproduce the ship, they create something new in its path. But the ship was there, and that's what we're still grappling with. It's called In the Wake, Christina Sharp, with an E on the end of P. So brilliant. Yes, go ahead.
I also am like, I don't know, talk to Kiara, because Kiara and Bridges, like, she's brilliant, she's so smart, like, and she's just so thoughtful in the way that she looks at the lineages of this work. I'm gonna pick up on one word that you said of literature, and I think of the work that we're doing we think about these stories in this modern way, but that's not also necessarily something that has always happened, or it's not new. I think so much about the way in which reproduction has been written into literature, especially like during the Harlem Renaissance, and I think a lot about just the ways in which we've put our pain and our joy and our reproduction into writing to give voice to that throughout history and like what that looks like. And I will do a tiny plug for, there's multiple books down there. There's ours, right? And then there's another one that we wrote a chapter for called Liberation Stories, about the shifting language around abortion. But there's a third one down there. It's called Abortion Stories, and it's edited by Dr. Karen Weingarten, who is at CUNY at Queens College, and she includes original writing by writers from when abortion was a crime, and so it's specifically, it's got Lucille Clifton in there, and Langston Hughes, and Georgia Douglas Johnson, and hers is the first known poem about abortion. And so I don't know if this is totally answering your question, but I just, when you said literature and like just those lineages, that's what I was thinking of. And I wrote the afterword for that book, and it was just such an honor to be able to, like, in particular, link some of the lineages from Gwendolyn Brooks to then Lucille Clifton to then, like, Ani DeFranco in this, like, the mother, the lost baby, and then, like, Ani DeFranco's, I'm forgetting the name of her song, that, like, it's a lineage of talking about abortion and motherhood in this art. And same thing, Shirley Chisholm's in there, and then we have Barbara Lee sharing her story, right? This is something that is passed on, and it's incredibly beautiful. And I think we have these incredibly talented contemporary writers who are writing about abortion in all spatial, temporal, time, whatever. But I also think it's important to, like, look at the folks who were doing it at a time when that's something that was absolutely not allowed to be talked about and was deeply criminalized, as they're also then being prosecuted for being writers and talking about things like communism and Black liberation and whatnot. So anyway, that was kind of how I wanted to interpret your question.
Can I give a title?
Yeah.
Remember I said I couldn't remember the name. Jessamine Ward, Let Us Descend.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Beautiful
yes.
book. Beautiful book.
About women and enslavement. A
Gorgeous
beautiful,
book.
beautiful novel. Okay.
I want to add a little nerdy thing too about epigenetics from like a writerly perspective, because I think about this all of the time. Because I think often the way we talk about epigenetics is also steeped in white supremacy.
Yes.
Because when I think about it this creatively, right, outside of like in relationship with the science, but really from a creative standpoint, when we talk about what it means, what epigenetics means, right? Going through things so traumatic, so necessary that we write it into our genes to pass down, right? We often talk about it as, now I carry this trauma, but you're not always carrying the trauma, you're carrying the preparation for the world. And yes, luckily, as time passes, perhaps we do not need all of the preparation, and then we have problems. But when we actually go back through the root of many of the epigenetics we're passing down, often what it is this happened at this time, and this was the only defense available. And that defense has been passed down. Right? And yes, it looks like problems today, but it only looks like problems today when we divorce it from our history. And so I think the through line of what we're talking about in reclaiming our history, I also think when we talk about epigenetics, we need to reclaim it as well and look at it as a genetic level of love, saying, I love you so much that I will imprint this to make sure that you have one more tool that I did not have. And part of, there's a book called Joy is My Justice that theorizes, if we have this preparation that goes one way, can we send healing back? Right? If this is being sent for us, what does it mean to be able to heal to the point that we know that is no longer needed? I no longer have to pass this down, right? How does that create a circle of love that goes right back to our ancestors that gave us these protections in the first place? And I just hope that when we look at writing, I often think of writing in the same way. I think we're carrying these stories forward, and we all hope to be able to write a different story in the future that can be in conversation with the stories of the past, and that recognizes and says, thank you for giving us the preparation for where we are today.
I'll just one quick tiny thing. I just want to say, in writing this book, I interviewed a lot of my family members who had abortions, particularly my Black family and my mother. And being able to write this and being able to talk with her about it when it's something that she did not talk about, that was healing for her. And so I think that there's a lot of like, oh, we should talk to the younger folks, but also actually we should be talking to each other and the generations before us so that, you know, before folks transition, you can actually just let the weight go and we can give that, I see you. I see you. You are so loved, and you deserve to be able to let go of that weight. We all do. And I think it's important that we pass that back in addition to passing it forward.
Thank you all very, very, very much. This was clearly an amazing panel and a conversation that needs to be continued. So thank you to our brilliant moderator, and our outstanding panelists who gave us a lot to think about. So this is not the last time that you will see them, because what are we going to do? We're going to support our authors. We're not just going to have a conversation about, oh, how wonderful they were. We're going to go downstairs and we're going to purchase their books. Guess what? They're right downstairs and they'll sign them for you. And we do have another panel coming up. Of course, as you can see, if you've been looking at the schedule, we're all running a little behind schedule. So we have another panel coming up, which will start about 3 o'clock. So you have a half hour to get your book, get it signed, and support our Black small businesses downstairs. All right? They have a lot of great things down there. So we hope to see you back here at 3 o'clock. Thank you.